Two hunters smash through his cell door to drag away the empty boy with a bounty on his head. They laugh. He just sits on the floor, coal on his fingers, not a single seal. And then he flips a sheet of paper, and 1 second later, both of them have nothing below the knees. No blood, no bone. Smooth emptiness, like the legs never existed. Now rewind 3 days. He woke to the smell of burning flesh, his own. A red-hot iron pressed a seal into his palm, and the mark cracked and burned through without catching. A failed binding. In this world, magic lives in marks branded into skin, and his mark is broken. That makes him nothing, worth less than the dry bread on the table. The old monk, Brother Oren, sobs over him. He says the boy came to the monastery 3 years ago as an orphan. He says today was supposed to bond the boy to an element. Instead, the seal died, officially sealless, empty. But here is what the monk does not know. The boy remembers another life. He remembers soul, instant coffee at 4 in the morning, a drawing tablet glowing in the dark, a steering wheel slipping, and a concrete pillar filling the windshield, and 43,000 won an unpaid client still owed him. The last thought of his old life. His name was Ha-eun, and 7 years of art academy training live in fingers that now belong to a stranger. He reaches for the coal stub on the table. He drops the tip to the paper and draws one line, a clean curve. His hand shakes, but the stroke holds. He keeps going. He draws a cup. Not any cup, the white mug with the hairline crack near the handle that sat on his sole desk for 4 years. He renders the weight of it, the light pooling in the rim, the coffee ring that never washed out. He finishes the last stroke, and the paper glows. The mug falls off the page and hits the stone floor with a dull thud. It rolls and stops against his knee. Warm, real, even the faint smell of old coffee. Brother Oren drops to his knees and presses his forehead to the ground and whispers, "Miracle." Ha-eun shakes his head. Not a miracle, a drawing. 2 days of experiments follow, and one brutal rule emerges. Quality in equals quality out. He sketches a candle, and a real flame appears. He sketches bread, and it tastes like bread, but flat because he rushed the texture. He sketches a knife, and the blade cuts, but the edge runs uneven because he sketched the grind angle carelessly. Sloppy art makes a sloppy thing. The same law that ruled his whole career. The medium changed, the rule did not. Brother Oren names it, the seal of likeness, the lowest of the low, a party trick for village fairs. No one in monastery history ever made it produce anything real. Ha-eun asks how many people with this seal ever trained 7 years at an art academy. The monk does not understand the question. Then, on the second night, he finds the eraser. He sketches the wooden stool in his cell just to test proportions. He rubs the charcoal off with his thumb, and the stool vanishes. Not the drawing of the stool, the actual stool, the one that stood there for years. Gone. No sound, no flash, just absence. He stares at the empty floor. He looks at his thumb. He says one word to himself. Fine. It is not fine. Third morning, the door bursts open. 2 men in black leather, silver thorns on the chest plate. House Vesper. 5 glowing seals on each forearm, pulsing blue and white. Hunters. The lowest rank of the house army, and still strong enough to flatten a building. One looks at the boy on the floor with coal on his fingers and laughs, says the monk wasted their time. The other says, take him anyway, the bounty is posted. But Ha-eun heard the boots in the corridor 20 minutes ago. He grabbed a fresh sheet. He did not draw a weapon. He did not draw a shield. He sketched their boots. Standard cavalry boots, thick soles, buckles at the ankle, rough but accurate. He holds the paper face down on his knee. The first hunter reaches for his collar. Ha-eun flips up his other hand and shows them a drawing of the mug. The mug drops from the page and shatters between them. The hunters freeze. 1 second of confusion. Ha-eun flips the boot sketch back over and drags his thumb across it. Hard, fast. The charcoal smears. Both men collapse. They hit the stone with the sound of meat dropping off a hook. Below the knees, nothing. The leather armor ends in empty air. They scream. His nose bleeds. His skull splits like someone drove a nail through his temple. That is the cost. A small sketch costs little. Erasing something that already existed in this world costs far more. He wipes his nose and looks at the two men writhing. He feels sick. Not from the magic, from how easy it was. He removed their legs the way he removed stray lines from a composition. 1 thumb stroke. He tells them quietly that this is what happens when a client refuses to pay. Neither man hears him. Brother Ha-eun appears in the doorway, white as bone. He says, "More will come. House Vesper never sends just 2. If this pair does not return by nightfall, a full squad follows. Hours, maybe less." Ha-eun asks for more paper. The monk shakes his head. Only 11 sheets of cheap gray stock on the table. Not enough for a battle. Barely enough for a week. He rolls them tight and tucks them in his robe with the charcoal stub. The monk tells him about Lienbrook, 3 days south through the forest, a paper mill and an engraver shop. No one in a border town checks seals. Ha-eun asks what happens to the monk when the hunters find him here. Brother Ha-eun smiles, the saddest smile Ha-eun has seen in either life. He says he has lived long enough. He says this monastery hides a secret older than House Vesper and older than the kingdom, and that Ha-eun will understand when the time comes. He presses a leather pouch into the boy's hand. 3 sticks of compressed charcoal and a folded altar cloth, thick and smooth, far better than the gray paper. Ha-eun wants to say something worthy of the moment. He says thank you. It is not enough. It is all he has. He slips out the back gate as the sun drops and the forest swallows him in minutes. He does not hear the hunters arrive an hour later. He does not hear Brother Ha-eun refuse to speak. He does not hear the fire. But long past midnight, he smells smoke on the wind, and he knows. Ha-eun walked south for 3 days through a forest that smelled like wet stone and rotting pine. He slept in hollows between root clusters and ate twice. Once from a drawn loaf of bread that tasted like flour and air because he had rushed the crust detail. Once from a handful of wild berries that his new body's stomach recognized even if his mind did not. His left palm ached constantly. The failed seal pulsed with dull heat like a burn that refused to heal. He kept it wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from his robe. Every few hours, he unwrapped it and looked at the mark. It was a circle that had not closed, an incomplete ring with jagged edges where the iron had slipped. In this world, it meant failure. In his old world, it would have been an interesting design element. He almost admired it. Almost. On the second night, he counted his supplies. 3 sticks of compressed charcoal, 1 folded piece of altar cloth, roughly the size of 2 notebook pages, 11 sheets of gray paper, the charcoal stub from the cell. He calculated usage rates the way he used to calculate freelance budgets. If each sheet held 1 drawing and each drawing was a single object, he had maybe 15 creations before he was empty-handed. 15 chances to survive in a world where the average soldier carried 5 seals and could throw fire from his palms. He needed paper. He needed ink. He needed a surface that would not tear when he pressed hard during detail work. Most of all, he needed to stop shaking. His hands had trembled since the monastery, not from cold, not from fear, from the memory of what his thumb had done to those two men. He kept seeing the empty space below their knees, the clean absence. In 7 years of drawing, he had erased thousands of lines, millions maybe. Every single one had been ink or graphite or pixels on a screen. None of them had been a person's legs. He told himself it was self-defense. He told himself they would have killed him, or worse. He told himself all the things a reasonable person would say. And then he drew a small bird on one of his gray sheets, just to watch something come alive instead of disappear. The bird was a sparrow. He drew it from a reference burned into his memory, a photograph he had used in his 3rd year at Academy for a life studies assignment. Brown feathers, black eye, tilted head. The drawing took 12 minutes because his hands were still unsteady. When the last line connected, the sparrow peeled off the page and hopped onto his knee. It weighed almost nothing. It chirped once, a thin sound like a wire being plucked. Then it flew to a branch above his head and sat there, looking at him. It was not perfect. The left wing was slightly too long because he had overextended a stroke. The tail feathers had a smudged quality that made them look wet. But it was alive. It breathed. It turned its head to track sounds. And when Ha-eun said the word hello, it chirped again, as if it recognized the concept of greeting. He named it draft because it was a first attempt. And because in Korean, the word for draft and the word for wind sounded similar enough that the pun made him exhale through his nose, which was the closest he came to laughing these days. Draft rode on his shoulder for the rest of the journey. The sparrow was temporary. Ha-eun could feel it. Quick sketches faded after a few hours. The bread had gone stale and transparent by morning. The mug from the cell would probably crack within a week. Only work that he truly finished. Inked and detailed and loved. Only that would last. Draft had maybe a day before it dissolved back into nothing. Ha-eun found that he minded this more than he expected. On the evening of the 3rd day, the trees thinned and he saw Lienbrook. It was smaller than he had imagined. A cluster of stone and timber buildings set along a river with a bridge in the center and a watermill at the east end. Smoke rose from chimneys. People moved through the main street carrying tools and bundles. No soldiers visible, no banners, no seals glowing on exposed forearms. This was a working town, a place where hands were valued for what they built, not what they burned. Ha-eun pulled his hood forward and walked down the slope toward the bridge. The sparrow on his shoulder dissolved as he reached the gate. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. Just a faint shimmer in the air, and then nothing. He felt it vanish like a string being cut inside his chest. A tiny tug, a tiny loss. He adjusted his collar where Draft had been sitting and kept walking. The engraver's shop was easy to find. It was the only building with a sign that featured a carved pen nib. The owner was a squat man named Tomas, with arms like a blacksmith and ink permanently embedded in the creases of his knuckles. He looked at Ha-eun and saw what everyone in Lienbrook would see. A thin young man with no seals, no family, no trade guild mark. Just dust on his clothes and coal under his nails. Tomas asked what he wanted. Ha-eun said he could draw. Tomas laughed. "Everyone can draw," the man said. "My daughter draws flowers on her school books. That does not make her useful." Ha-eun asked for a piece of paper and a pen. Tomas gave him both with the expression of a man humoring a stray cat. Ha-eun sat on the shop stool and in 4 minutes drew a portrait of Tomas. Not a caricature, not a sketch, a portrait. He captured the way the man's left eye sat slightly higher than the right, the scar on his chin that he probably got from a slipped chisel, the way his collar was frayed on one side because he rubbed it when thinking. Tomas looked at the portrait and went quiet. He looked at it for a long time. Then he offered Ha-eun a job, room and board, and 3 silver a week. Ha-eun took it. He did not use magic, not once. For 3 weeks, he worked in the engraver's shop as a draftsman. He copied designs onto printing plates. He cleaned tools. He swept floors. He learned the names of local paper types and ink mixtures and binding techniques. He learned that Lienbrook's paper mill produced a heavy cotton stock that held charcoal better than anything he had touched in either life. He bought 6 sheets with his first week's pay. At night, in the small room above the shop, he practiced, not magic, drawing. He drew the view from his window. He drew the bridge. He drew Tomas and the shop cat and the pattern of moss on the stone wall across the street. He drew with the same discipline he had kept in Seoul, every night until his hand cramped, every morning starting again. The difference was that now each drawing hummed with potential. He could feel the ethereum layer of this world pressing against his paper like a tide against a dam. Every line he drew was a crack in that dam. Every finished piece was a flood waiting to happen. He kept the dam closed. He did not bring anything to life. He did not erase anything. He was invisible, and he intended to stay that way. But on the 22nd night in Lienbrook, he could not sleep. He sat at his desk with a single sheet of the good cotton paper and a fresh stick of charcoal. And without planning it, he started to draw a person. Not a soldier, not a weapon, a woman. She formed under his hand the way characters always did when he was not trying too hard. First the jawline, then the neck, the fall of hair over one shoulder. He drew her the way he drew when no one was watching. Slowly, gently, without the pressure of a client or a deadline or the voice in his head that said, "Nobody cares about your work." He drew her as someone who looked like she had just woken up and was not yet worried about the day. Calm, present, with eyes that did not need anything from the viewer. He worked until dawn. 6 hours of continuous drawing, the most he had spent on a single piece since his graduation project in Seoul. When morning light came through the window and touched the paper, the drawing was complete. He set down the charcoal and looked at her. Then the paper glowed, and she opened her eyes. She sat on the floor of his room with her back against the desk leg and looked at him. She did not scream, she did not gasp. She blinked twice and then looked at her own hands as if checking that they were real. They were. Ha-eun could see the faint lines on her palms, the slight asymmetry of her fingers, the way the morning light caught the tiny hairs on her forearm. He had drawn all of that, every detail, and now it breathed. Her hair was ash gray and fell past her shoulders. Her eyes were a muted green. She was tall, even sitting down. He had drawn her in a simple linen shirt and dark trousers because that was what felt right at 4 in the morning, when he was not thinking about armor or weapons or anything useful. She looked at him, and he could see the question forming. Not confusion, not fear, something closer to patience. As if she was waiting for him to explain the situation before deciding how she felt about it. Ha-eun opened his mouth and closed it again. In 7 years of professional art, he had never once had a drawing look back at him and wait for context. He told her his name was Ha-eun. He told her she was in a town called Lienbrook. He told her that he had drawn her on a piece of paper and that she had come alive, and that he understood how insane that sounded. She listened. Then she asked a question. She asked what her name was. He had not planned one. He had not planned any of this, but the word came out of him before he could think about it. Seren. It meant star in a language he had read about once in a fantasy novel back in Seoul. It also meant calm in another. Both fit. She said the name once to herself, as if tasting it. Then she nodded, as if the name was acceptable, as if she had a choice. He realized in that moment that she did. He had not drawn a puppet. He had drawn a person. And the difference between the two was everything. The first hour was strange. Seren stood and walked to the window and looked out at the town. She asked about the bridge, about the river, about the smoke from the bakery chimney. Each question was specific and measured. She was not making conversation. She was building a model of the world in her head one observation at a time. Ha-eun answered everything. He told her about Erelon, about the seals, about his own situation. He told her that he was from another world and that his body was not his original one. He told her about the monastery and Brother Oren and the 2 hunters whose legs he had erased. He held nothing back because lying to someone you created felt like a crime he could not name. Seren listened to all of it. Then she asked the one question he was not ready for. She asked if she would stop existing when the drawing faded. Ha-eun looked at the charcoal portrait on his desk. A quick sketch faded in hours. A careful drawing lasted days. But this, 6 hours of focused work on good paper with real intention. He did not know how long she had. He told her he did not know. Seren looked at the drawing, and then at him, and then at the window. She said that in that case, she would like to see the bridge before it happened. They walked through Lienbrook in the early morning before the shops opened. Seren moved like someone who had always known how to walk, but was experiencing ground for the first time. She felt the cobblestones through her shoes and paused to look at the patterns. She touched the stone railing of the bridge and held her hand there for a long time. Ha-eun watched her and felt something crack inside his chest. Not pain, something older, something that had been locked since the last gallery rejection in Seoul. The feeling that what he made mattered to someone. The drawing on his desk was just charcoal on cotton paper. But the woman standing on the bridge looking at the water was real. She was real because he had cared about every line. He had not drawn her for a client, not for a competition, not for money. He had drawn her for the same reason he drew anything when he was being honest with himself. Because the act of seeing someone clearly and putting that vision on paper was the only thing he had ever been good at. Seren turned and told him his face was doing something strange. He realized he was almost crying. He wiped his eyes and told her it was allergies. She said there was no pollen in autumn. He told her it was magical allergies. She looked at him for a moment, and then something happened. The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. The first smile she ever made. He would remember that smile for the rest of his life. They returned to the room, and Ha-eun did something he had never done before. He sat down and drew Seren again. Not a new creation, an addition. He drew her on the same paper, standing on the bridge with the water below and the morning light in her hair. He added the detail of her hand on the railing, the exact position of her fingers, the shadow under her jaw. He was drawing what he had seen, what was already real. And when he finished, the portrait shifted on the page. The original drawing and the new one merged. Seren gasped softly. She looked at her hand and flexed her fingers. She said she felt more solid, more present, as if a part of her that had been thin and uncertain was now anchored. Ha-eun understood. Every time he drew her, he was adding to her reality, not changing her, not controlling her, just seeing her more completely and putting that vision down in lines. The more he saw her, the more real she became. Seren looked at him with those muted green eyes and said something that hit him like a truck. She said she understood now what she was, that she was a drawing, that her existence depended on his attention, and that she was choosing to stay anyway. Not because she had no choice, because she wanted to know what happened next. Ha-eun sat with the charcoal in his hand and realized that he had just created the first person in his life who believed his work was worth watching, and he had no idea what to do with that. The next week changed everything. Seren lived in the room above the shop, and no one questioned her presence because Ha-eun told Tomas she was his cousin from the north. Tomas did not believe this for a second, but he liked Seren because she organized his filing system in 2 days and made tea that tasted like someone actually cared about the water temperature. Seren learned the world quickly. She read every book in the shop. She talked to the miller and the baker and the old woman who sold herbs by the bridge. She came back each evening and told Ha-eun what she had learned: the political situation, the trade routes, the rumor that House Vesper was doubling patrols on the western roads, the fact that 3 villages in the north had gone silent in the past month. Tidy houses, no bodies, no fire, just empty. Ha-eun listened and drew. Every night, he added to her portrait small details: the way she tucked hair behind her ear, a new line at the corner of her mouth from the first time she laughed at one of his bad jokes, a slight change in her posture from the day she learned to chop vegetables and stood taller in the kitchen afterward. Each addition made her more real, more independent, more herself, and each addition cost him something. After 3 nights of drawing, he felt hollow in a way he could not explain. Not tired, hollow, as if a piece of him had been taken out and given away. He looked at Serene and realized with a slow, cold clarity that this was the price. Her calmness was his calmness, the steady, patient certainty that lived in her voice. He had drawn it into her, and now he had less of it in himself. He had given her the best part of his nature and kept the anxious rest. This was how the seal of likeness worked. Not just magic and paper, soul distribution. He said nothing. Seren noticed the change because Seren noticed everything. She told him he was sleeping less and fidgeting more, and his sketches had become tighter and more controlled, as if he was afraid of losing precision. She told him to stop drawing her for a while and rest. He said he was fine. She said that was the 3rd time he had said fine in an hour, and that the word was losing all meaning. He looked at her and thought about how, in Seoul, no one had ever told him to stop working. Not once. Not his parents, not his teachers, not the gallery owners who said try harder, not the clients who said revise again. No one had ever looked at his exhausted hands and said, enough, put it down, sleep. And here was a woman made of paper and charcoal and 6 hours of his loneliest night telling him to rest. He put down the charcoal. He slept. And for the first time in either of his lives, someone sat beside him and watched over his work. The hunters arrived in Leanbrook on a Tuesday. Ha-eun knew they were coming because Seren told him at dawn. She had been at the baker's shop listening to morning gossip, and a merchant from the North Road mentioned a squad of 6 men in black leather riding hard toward town, silver thorns on their chest plates. House Vesper. Ha-eun had 12 minutes to make a decision. He could run, south into the farmlands and then east toward the coastal road. He had enough paper for a few days of survival. He could create food and shelter and disappear into the countryside. But Tomas would pay for sheltering him. The engraver who gave him a job and asked no questions would lose his shop, maybe more. House Vesper did not leave loose threads. Ha-eun asked Seren how much time they had. She said the riders would reach the town gate in about 15 minutes at their current pace. He looked at his supplies: 7 sheets of cotton paper, 2.5 sticks of charcoal, 1 stick of compressed graphite he had bought from a traveling merchant last week, and the altar cloth from Brother Oren, which he had been saving for something important. He picked up 1 sheet of paper and started drawing. Not a weapon, a face. He drew Tomas a new identity, a different nose, a wider jaw, a scar in the wrong place. He worked fast, 3 minutes for a sketch that would hold for maybe a day, long enough for the engraver to walk past hunters without being recognized. He left the drawing on Tomas's workbench with a note explaining nothing. The less the man knew, the better. Then he packed his supplies into a leather satchel that Seren had sewn from scrap material at the shop, and they left through the back door. The bridge was the problem. It was the only way across the river, and the main road ran straight through it. The hunters would post someone there. Ha-eun stopped at the riverbank and looked at the water. Then he looked at his paper. Then he looked at Seren. She read his face before he spoke. She told him not to waste a full sheet on a bridge. He looked at the river again. It was wide, but not deep, maybe waist height at the center. The current was moderate. He could wade across. He asked Seren if she could swim. She looked at the water and then at him and said she did not know. She had existed for 8 days. Swimming had not come up. He realized that every skill she had was either something he had drawn into her or something she had learned in the past week. He had not drawn her swimming. He had drawn her calm and observant and good with books. None of those helped in a river. He tore a small corner from one of his sheets and drew a quick sketch. A rope. Thick hemp, about 20 feet long. It appeared in his hand with a soft glow. Rough fibers, real weight. He tied one end to a tree on the bank and held the other. They crossed together. The water was cold and the current pulled at his legs, but the rope held. On the other side, they were both soaking wet and shivering. Ha-eun felt the familiar headache behind his eyes. Even a small creation cost something. The rope had been quick and rough, maybe an hour of weakness. He could manage. They walked south through farmland for the rest of the morning. Around midday, Seren stopped and pointed at the road ahead. A girl was sitting on a stone wall beside a broken cart. She was small, maybe 16. Black hair cut short and uneven, as if she had done it herself with a dull blade. A scar ran through her left eyebrow. She was eating an apple and watching them approach with the sharp, evaluating eyes of someone who counted exits before entering rooms. Ha-eun slowed down. The girl looked harmless. But he had learned in his first week in Erelon that appearance meant nothing in a world where a child could carry 3 seals and burn a house down with a thought. Seren walked forward and spoke first. She asked the girl if she was all right. The girl said she was fine. Her cart had broken an axle and she was waiting for it to fix itself. She said this with a completely straight face. Then she looked at Ha-eun and her eyes dropped to his hand. The wrapped left palm, the charcoal dust on his fingers, the leather satchel held tight against his body. She asked if he was a painter. Ha-eun said no. He said he was a draftsman. The girl said that was funny because she had seen a notice in the last town about a draftsman. Young man, thin, no seals, charcoal on his hands, wanted by House Vesper for heresy and destruction of property. Reward of 50 gold marks. Ha-eun went still. 50 gold marks was more than Tomas made in a year. The girl took another bite of her apple and said she was not interested in the reward. She said 50 gold was the kind of money that got you killed before you could spend it, because House Vesper would just take it back once you delivered the target. She said she was more interested in the satchel, specifically what was inside it. Seren stepped between them. The girl held up both hands and showed her palms. No seals. Clean skin. She was sealless, like Ha-eun, like every other person at the bottom of this world. She said her name was Minju. She said she had been living on the road since she was 12, after her village threw her out for being empty. She said she was a thief, and she was good at it, and she was not ashamed. She also said that she had tried to steal his satchel 10 minutes ago while he was crossing the river, but the tall woman with the gray hair had spotted her. She said this while looking at Seren with genuine respect. Ha-eun looked at Seren. Seren nodded. She had seen the girl crouching behind the wall and had said nothing because she wanted to see what Minju would do. The fact that the girl had revealed herself instead of running told Seren something about her character. Ha-eun asked Minju what she wanted. Minju said she wanted to not be alone. She said it without drama or self-pity, just a statement of fact delivered between bites of apple. She said the roads were getting dangerous. Whole villages disappearing in the night, hunters everywhere. A sealless girl traveling alone had a life expectancy measured in weeks. Ha-eun looked at this small, scarred girl sitting on a wall eating a stolen apple. And he thought about every art student he had known in Seoul who had too much talent and no one watching. He told her she could walk with them, but the satchel was off limits. Minju jumped off the wall and fell into step beside them, as if she had always been there. Within an hour, she had told them her entire life story. Orphan, streets of a city called Ha-eun, pickpocketing since age 9, She had tried to get a seal at 15, like everyone else. The iron had burned her skin, and nothing happened. The man performing the ritual had not even looked sorry. He had just waved the next child forward. She had walked out of the temple and never gone back. Ha-eun listened and said nothing. Seren listened and asked Minju if she had eaten anything besides the apple today. Minju said no. Seren looked at Ha-eun. He pulled out a sheet of paper and drew a bowl of rice. Not the gray, tasteless rice he had been producing with quick sketches. He took his time, 5 minutes. He remembered the exact way his mother's rice looked in the blue ceramic bowl on their kitchen table in Seoul. The slight gloss on the surface, the steam curling upward, the single grain that always stuck to the rim. The bowl appeared warm in his hands. He gave it to Minju. She looked at it, then at him. Then she ate it so fast she almost choked. When she finished, she held the empty bowl and stared into it for a long time. Then she said it was the best rice she had ever had. Ha-eun did not tell her it was his mother's recipe. Some things were not for sharing yet. They reached the outskirts of Aachen by nightfall. The city was 10 times the size of Lenbrook. Stone walls 30 feet high. Guard towers with sealed soldiers visible at the parapets. Banners of 3 different noble houses hanging from the gate. Aachen was a trading hub where every faction had a presence and no single house controlled the streets. It was the best place to disappear. It was also the worst place to be caught. Minju knew the city. She led them through a side gate used by merchants after dark. A bribe of 2 copper coins to a guard who did not look at faces. Then through narrow streets that smelled like sewage and frying oil until they reached a district of abandoned workshops near the old printing quarter. Minju stopped in front of a building with a collapsed roof and boarded windows. She said this used to be a print shop. The owner had died of fever 2 years ago, and no one had claimed the property because the guild fees were higher than the building was worth. The basement was dry, the press was rusted, but the tables were solid, and no one came here, ever. Ha-eun walked inside and looked around. Stone walls, a heavy wooden table, shelves that once held type blocks, a window in the ceiling that let in moonlight. It smelled like old ink and dust and something faintly chemical that he recognized as linseed oil. It smelled like a studio. He set his satchel on the table and pulled out his remaining paper. 6 sheets. He looked at the moonlight falling on the table. He looked at Seren standing in the doorway. He looked at Minju already poking through drawers looking for anything worth stealing. He said, "This would do." Seren asked what would do. He said, "The studio." For the first time since he arrived in this world, he said the word without flinching. Minju asked what a studio was. Ha-eun said it was a place where someone made things that nobody asked for. Minju said that sounded like a waste of time. Ha-eun said she was not wrong, but it was the only kind of time he knew how to spend. The first week in the basement was about survival. Minju knew where to find food in Aachen without paying for it. Market stalls that left bruised fruit in crates by the back door. A baker who threw out day-old bread at noon. A fishmonger who traded scraps for gossip. She moved through the city like water through cracks, invisible when she wanted to be, loud when it served her. Ha-eun told her to stop stealing from people who could not afford it. Minju told him that everyone in the old quarter was someone who could not afford it. He accepted this and said nothing more. Seren organized the basement. She cleaned the tables. She sorted the rusted type blocks into boxes and stacked them against the wall. She found an old oil lamp with enough fuel for a week. She hung a curtain across one corner for sleeping and another across the opposite corner for what she called the work area. She did all of this without being asked. When Ha-eun thanked her, she said there was nothing to thank. A studio needed order. She said this as if she had always known what a studio needed, even though the concept had not existed in her vocabulary 10 days ago. Ha-eun spent the first 3 days searching for materials. Paper was expensive in Aachen. Good paper was nearly impossible to find. The city's print shops used coarse stock, meant for pamphlets and notices, nothing with the weight and texture he needed for detailed work. He visited 9 shops and bought nothing. On the 4th day, Minju dragged him to a building near the south wall. It was a bookbinder's workshop. Half the roof was missing, and the front windows were covered in grime, but the sign above the door still read Kant and Sons, Binding and Restoration. Inside, he found a woman his age sitting at a workbench surrounded by damaged books. She had red hair tied back with a leather cord, ink stains on her fingers and her wrists, and a smudge on her chin, round glasses that sat slightly crooked on her nose. She was sewing a book spine with the kind of precise hand motion that Ha-eun recognized immediately. The motion of someone who had done the same thing 10,000 times. Her name was Everly Kant. She was 24 years old, the last of her family. Her father had been the finest bookbinder in Aachen before House Vesper seized his workshop for unpaid guild taxes. He had died 6 months later. Of what? Of giving up. Everly had kept the shop running on scraps, repair work, rebinding old volumes for merchants who cared more about appearance than content. She made enough to eat, not enough to matter. Ha-eun asked if she had paper. Everly looked at him over her crooked glasses and asked what kind. He said the best she had. She reached under her workbench and pulled out a drawer he had not noticed. Inside were 12 sheets of paper so white and smooth that Ha-eun's fingers tingled when he touched them. Heavy cotton ragstock, hand-pressed, with a texture that would hold charcoal like a lover's hand. He asked where she got it. She said she made it. Her father had taught her the old method before the guild standardized everything into cheap pulp. She made maybe 20 sheets a year. She used them for nothing, because no one in Aachen valued paper this good. Ha-eun looked at the paper, and then at Everly, and then at the paper again. He asked how much. Everly named a price that was 3 times his total savings. Then she looked at his face and lowered it to twice his savings. Then she looked at the charcoal on his fingers and the way he held the paper. Not by the edges, like a merchant checking stock, by the center, flat palm, feeling the grain, the way her father used to hold it. She told him to draw something. Ha-eun took a piece of his cheap gray paper and drew her workshop, the workbench, the books, the crooked glasses, the light falling through the broken roof onto her hands. It took 10 minutes. He did not bring it to life. He just drew it. But it was the kind of drawing that made the real room look like a rough draft by comparison. Every shadow in the right place, every proportion exact. The pile of books on the left side of the bench captured with a precision that made you feel the weight of each volume. Everly looked at the drawing for a long time. She removed her glasses and cleaned them and put them back on and looked again. She said her father would have liked him. Then she gave him all 12 sheets for free. She said paper this good deserved hands that understood it. Ha-eun tried to argue. She told him to stop. She said the paper was worthless sitting in a drawer. It was valuable in his hands. This was not charity. This was allocation of resources. Ha-eun recognized the logic because it was the same logic he used when choosing which project deserved his best materials. You did not waste good stock on bad work, and you did not hoard good stock when good work was waiting. He took the paper and told Everly something he had never told a supplier before. He told her that without her, he was just a man with charcoal. She looked at him, and for a moment, the steady competence in her expression cracked. Just a little. Just enough for him to see the girl underneath who had spent 2 years alone in a dead man's workshop being told by every merchant in the city that binding was a dying trade and her skills were obsolete. Then she put her glasses straight and said she would make him more. He said he could not pay. She said he could pay by making the paper worth something. He said that was the best deal he had ever made, and he meant it more than he had meant anything in 2 lifetimes. That night, Ha-eun sat at the table in the basement with Everly's paper spread before him and Seren's quiet presence at his shoulder, and Minju asleep in the corner with a stolen blanket pulled over her head. He looked at his hands. Charcoal dust in the creases. Faint tremor in his right index finger from years of overwork. The failed seal on his left palm glowing dull red under the bandage. These hands had drawn 10,000 pictures that no one bought. These hands had stacked rejection letters and formatted invoices and held a steering wheel that slipped at 3 a.m. on a bridge in Seoul. And now, these hands were all that stood between him and a world that wanted to use him, or erase him. He picked up the charcoal and pressed it to the first sheet of Everly's paper. The surface accepted the mark with a soft whisper, like the paper had been waiting. He started drawing. Not Seren, not a weapon, not food or shelter. He drew the basement, the table, the lamp, the curtain, the sleeping girl in the corner, the tall woman with ash-gray hair standing by the window. He drew the studio, his studio. With every line that the paper accepted, he felt the ethereum press closer, the magic of this world leaning in, watching. He drew until his hand cramped, and then he switched hands and drew more. By morning, the picture was finished. It was the most honest piece of work he had produced since graduation. Nothing was idealized. The cracks in the walls were there. The rust on the shelves was there. Minju's dirty feet sticking out from the blanket were there. Seren's tired eyes were there. It was not beautiful. It was true. And when the first light hit the paper, the drawing did not come to life the way his creations usually did. Instead, something subtler happened. The room itself shifted. The cracks sealed, not disappeared, sealed, as if someone had filled them with mortar. The lamp brightened. The table felt more solid under his hands. The air warmed by 2 degrees. He had not created something new. He had reinforced something that already existed. He had drawn his studio and made it more real. Seren looked at the walls and then at him. She said his nose was bleeding. He touched his upper lip and felt the warmth. He wiped it on his sleeve and looked at the red stain. Then he looked at the room. Solid, warm, safe. A place where he could work. He said it was worth it. Serene said nothing. She handed him a cloth and sat beside him, and they watched the morning light fill the basement through the window in the ceiling. Outside, Arkin was waking up, merchants opening shops, guards changing shifts. Somewhere in the city, a bell rang 6 times. In the basement, a tired artist with blood on his sleeve looked at the small, strange family he was building. A woman he had drawn from loneliness, a girl who had stolen his satchel, a bookbinder who gave away her best paper. None of them made sense together. All of them were here. Ha-eun picked up his charcoal and started a new sheet. He had work to do. Ha-eun spent the next 3 days drawing Everly's workshop from memory, not to create it, to understand it. He filled 2 sheets of cheap paper with studies of her tools, the bone folders, the awls, the thread spools, the small press she used to flatten signatures. Each drawing was a lesson in how this world made things, and each lesson told him something about how his own power worked. The better he understood an object, the more real his creation of it became. A sword drawn by someone who had never held one would be brittle and wrong. A sword drawn by someone who understood the weight and the grain of the steel and the way a hand wrapped around the grip would be deadly. He did not want to draw swords, but he needed to understand the principle. On the 4th morning, Everly arrived at the basement carrying a wooden box. Inside were 6 bottles of ink, 3 black, 1 blue, 1 red, 1 brown. She had made them herself from lamp black and iron gall and crushed minerals she had traded for with a dye merchant near the East Gate. She set the box on the table and told Ha-eun that charcoal was fine for sketches, but if he wanted permanence, he needed ink. Ha-eun opened the black bottle and dipped a finger in. The ink was thick and smooth, with a faint smell of tannin. He tested it on a scrap of paper, and the line came out rich and dark, with clean edges that held their shape. Better than any ink he had used in Seoul. He looked at Everly and said, "This was perfect." She adjusted her glasses and said, "Of course it was. She had been making ink since she was 9. Her father had insisted that a binder who did not understand ink was a carpenter who did not understand wood. Ha-eun asked her to stay, not in the basement, in his life. He told her he needed someone who understood materials the way she did, paper and ink and binding and the 1,000 small details that turned a drawing into something that lasted. Everly said she would think about it. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds and then asked where she should put her tools. Minju helped carry the rest of Everly's equipment from her shop over the next 2 days. Awls and needles and thread and sheets of leather and the small hand press and jars of paste and bottles of sizing solution. The basement began to look less like a hiding place and more like a workshop. Seren arranged everything with her usual quiet efficiency. She had a talent for organization that went beyond simple tidiness. She understood workflow. She placed the ink near the drawing table, and the binding tools near the drying rack, and the paper stock in the coolest, driest corner. When Ha-eun asked where she had learned this, she said she had not learned it. She just saw where things wanted to be. He understood. He had drawn her with an eye for composition, the ability to see how elements related to each other in space. In her, it had become something practical and grounding, another piece of himself living in someone else. On the 7th day in Arkan, Ha-eun drew his first portrait with ink. He chose Minju. She did not ask him to. She did not know he was going to. He started at midnight when she was asleep in her corner and worked by lamplight for 3 hours. He drew her standing, full height, without the scar on her eyebrow, without the dirt on her clothes. He drew her in a dark cloak with silver clasps, standing straight, looking directly at the viewer with the sharp, evaluating eyes that were her real eyes, but set in a face that was clean and fed and unafraid. It was not a lie. It was a possibility. The version of Minju that existed underneath the years of hunger and streets and being told she was nothing. When he finished, he did not activate the drawing. He hung it on the wall of the basement with a nail and a piece of twine. When Minju woke up the next morning, she saw it before she saw anything else. She stood in front of it for a long time. She did not speak. She touched the edge of the paper with one finger, as if making sure it was real. Then she went into the corner behind the curtain, and Ha-eun heard her crying. Not loud, not dramatic. The small, broken sound of someone seeing themselves for the first time, and not knowing what to do with it. Seren looked at Ha-eun. He looked at his hands. Everly kept working at her bench, and said nothing, because she understood that some moments required the dignity of being unwitnessed. Minju came out 20 minutes later, with red eyes and a straight back, and said she wanted to learn to draw. Ha-eun said he would teach her. She said she was not any good. He said neither was he when he started. She said that was obviously a lie, but she appreciated the effort. He handed her a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper. She drew a circle that looked like an egg that had been stepped on. He said it was a good start. She threw the charcoal at his head, but she came back the next night, and the next, and the next. The lessons became a rhythm. Every evening, after the day's work, Ha-eun sat with Minju at the table and taught her the basics: line weight, proportion, negative space. How to look at something not as a thing, but as a collection of shapes and shadows. Minju was terrible at all of it. Her lines wobbled, her proportions were wrong, her circles remained egg-shaped. But she kept coming back, and that was the only metric that mattered. 2 weeks into their stay in Arkan, the first real problem arrived. Not hunters, not House Vesper. Something worse. Serene came back from her morning walk through the market with news. 3 more villages had gone silent in the north. The pattern was the same as all the others. No bodies, no fire, no signs of attack. Just empty houses with meals still on tables and doors still closed. The locals were calling them quiet nights. The priests of the Church of Seven Seals were calling them divine punishment. The merchants were calling them bad for business. No one knew what was causing them. Ha-eun listened and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew what could cause that. He had done a small version of it in the monastery, the eraser function, the ability to remove something from existence as if it had never been, the clean absence. No blood, no wreckage, just gone. Someone was using the same power he had. Someone was erasing whole villages. He did not say this to the others. Not yet. He did not have enough information, and speaking fear into a room that was just beginning to feel safe seemed like a cruelty he could not justify. Instead, he asked Seren to gather more information. Routes, timing, direction, any pattern in which villages were targeted. She nodded and went back out. Ha-eun sat at his table and looked at his hands. These hands could erase a pair of boots from a man's feet. What could hands like his do if they had been working for 15 years instead of 3 weeks? What could they erase if they had stopped caring about the difference between boots and bodies, between objects and people, between a line on paper and a life? He picked up his charcoal and began to draw. Not a person, not a weapon, a map. He drew the northern border of Valantia from memory, using Seren's descriptions and the merchant maps he had studied in the print shop. He marked the locations of every village that had disappeared, 7 dots on cheap gray paper. When he stepped back and looked at the pattern, the dots formed a line, a slow, steady line moving south, toward Arkan. The woman arrived on a morning when Ha-eun was drawing a lock for the basement door. He had gotten tired of Minju's improvised security system, which consisted of a stack of tin cans balanced on a board. She walked down the steps as if she owned them. Blonde hair cut to jaw length, black uniform with silver trim at the cuffs and collar, 3 seals visible on her right forearm, blue and white lines that pulsed faintly with elemental energy. She carried no visible weapon, but her hands stayed at her sides in the loose, ready position of someone trained to kill quickly. Minju saw her first and grabbed a knife from the table. Seren stepped in front of Ha-eun. Everly did not move from her bench, but her hand found the heavy bone folder and gripped it like a dagger. The woman looked at all of them, and then at Ha-eun. She said his name. Not the name he used in Leanbrook, not the alias Minju had invented for him in Arkan, his real name. Ha-eun. She said she had been sent by the Caerdun Empire to make him an offer. Her name was Naomi Gray. She was 22 years old, half Valantian, half Caerdun, an illusionist with 3 seals specializing in perception distortion. She had crossed the border 6 weeks ago with forged papers and a simple mission. Find the sealless artist who erased 2 of House Vesper's hunters. Evaluate his abilities. Recruit him if possible. Kill him if not. She said all of this standing in his basement, as if she were reading a restaurant menu. Ha-eun asked which option she was leaning toward. Naomi said she had not decided yet. She said the offer was generous. A private workshop in the capital of Caerdun, unlimited paper, ink imported from 3 continents, a staff of assistants, a monthly salary that made Ha-eun's freelance rates look like pocket change. All he had to do was draw an army. Minju laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound. She said the Empire wanted to buy a weapon and put a bow on it. Naomi looked at her and said that was an accurate summary. Serene spoke for the first time. She asked Naomi what happened to artists who refused the empire's offers. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They stopped being artists." Ha-eun looked at the woman in the black uniform and thought about every art director who had ever told him to change his style to fit the market. Every publisher who said his work was too niche. Every client who wanted something amazing, but only wanted to pay for something adequate. The Empire was just another client. Bigger budget, same relationship. He told Naomi no. She did not look surprised. She looked almost relieved. She said she would have to report his refusal and that within 2 weeks, Ha-eun would send someone less polite. Ha-eun said he understood. Then he asked her if she wanted tea. Naomi blinked. It was the first time her composure cracked. She said she did not expect the target to offer her tea. Ha-eun said she was standing in his studio, and anyone who stood in his studio got tea. It was a rule he had just invented. Seren was already boiling water. Naomi sat at the table and drank tea with the people she had been sent to recruit or kill. And something happened that Ha-eun recognized because he had seen it before. In Seoul. In every freelancer meetup and late-night coffee shop and shared studio space he had ever worked in. The woman relaxed. Not completely. Not the trained killer in an enemy basement kind of relaxation. But the shoulders came down half an inch. The hands unclenched. The jaw loosened. Because for maybe the first time in her professional life, someone had treated her like a person in a room instead of a function in a system. Naomi stayed for 2 hours. She told them things she should not have told them. That Ha-eun's interest in Ha-eun was not casual. The emperor himself had read the reports. That the empire had been searching for a seal of likeness user for decades. That there were old texts in their archives describing what the seal could do at full power, and the descriptions were terrifying. She told them about herself, too. Born in a border town, mother Valantian, father a Ha-eun officer who left before she could walk. Raised by the Empire's intelligence corps from age 8, 3 seals earned through a training program that had a 40% mortality rate. She had survived because she was smart, and because being half-blood in Ha-eun meant you learned early that no one would save you if you fell. Ha-eun listened and drew. Not her, not a portrait. He drew a small bird on a scrap of paper while she talked. A sparrow, better than the first one he had made in the forest. This one had correct wing proportions and properly layered feathers. When it hopped off the page and landed on the table, Naomi stopped talking. She watched the bird tilt its head and chirp. Then she looked at Ha-eun and said that the intelligence reports had not mentioned this. She said they described his power as a combat ability, erasure, destruction, removal. They had not mentioned that he could make things that were alive and small and pointless and perfect. Ha-eun said that was because the reports were written by people who understood weapons but not art. Naomi left that afternoon. She said she would file her report, but she would take her time. She said she could give them maybe 3 weeks before Ha-eun sent the next team. At the door, she stopped and turned back. She looked at the sparrow sitting on the table, cleaning its feathers. She asked if it would last. Ha-eun said no. Quick sketches faded. By morning, it would be gone. Naomi nodded. She said it was a shame. Then she left. Ha-eun looked at Seren. Seren said the woman would come back. Ha-eun asked how she knew. Seren said because Naomi had looked at the sparrow the way people look at things they want to keep. The next 2 weeks were the most productive of Ha-eun's life. He had paper. He had ink, he had a workspace, and for the first time, he had people around him while he worked. In Seoul, he had always drawn alone. His apartment, his desk, his silence. Here, the basement hummed with activity. Everly mixed inks and sized paper and experimented with new binding techniques. Minju practiced her drawing every evening, producing circles that slowly became less egg-shaped. Seren read and planned and kept the workshop running and told Ha-eun to sleep when he forgot. And Ha-eun drew. He drew tools, a set of brushes with bamboo handles that he remembered from an art supply shop in Hongdae, a palette knife with the exact balance he preferred, an erasing compound that worked better than his thumb, Each creation was small and precise, and designed not for battle, but for making better creations. He was building his toolkit, the way any craftsman would. By the end of the second week, the wall of the basement was covered in drawings, studies, portraits, landscapes, anatomical sketches, architectural details, maps. It looked like the wall of a studio that had been occupied for years. It looked like home. Naomi came back on the 16th day. She was not wearing the black uniform. She was wearing a gray traveling cloak with the hood up, and she had a cut above her right eye that was still bleeding. She came down the basement steps fast and closed the door behind her and leaned against it. Seren stood. Minju grabbed her knife. Everly looked up from her bench. Naomi said 2 words. They found me. The Ha-eun Intelligence Corps had intercepted her delayed report. They knew she had made contact and failed to recruit or eliminate the target. A termination order had been issued, not for Ha-eun, for Naomi. She was a half-blood agent who had shown hesitation. In Ha-eun, that was the same as treason. She had killed the 2 operatives sent to execute her, but a third had escaped and was now reporting her location. Within a day, there would be a full extraction team in Arkan. Not for Ha-eun, not yet, for her. Ha-eun asked her why she came here. Naomi said because she had nowhere else to go. She said it with the flat voice of someone who had processed the emotion already and had arrived at the fact. Ha-eun looked at Seren. Seren looked back. Nothing needed to be said. They both knew. Ha-eun told Naomi she could stay. Minju protested. She said the woman was a spy and a killer, and that inviting her in was like feeding a stray wolf. Ha-eun said he was a sealless fugitive in a stolen body, and Seren was made of paper, and Minju was a thief who ate stolen apples. Nobody in this basement had standing to judge. Minju opened her mouth and closed it again. She kept the knife visible, but she stopped arguing. Naomi slept on the floor that night. In the morning, Ha-eun sat across from her and asked her everything she knew about Ha-eun's information on the seal of likeness. What she told him changed everything. The old texts in the Imperial archives described 2 functions of the seal, creation and erasure, but they also described a third function that Ha-eun had not discovered yet, overwriting, the ability to draw over existing reality. Not to erase and replace, to modify directly. A wall could be made taller. A river could be made wider. A person's memories could be altered if the artist understood the structure of the mind well enough to draw a new version. Naomi said the texts called this the highest expression of the seal. And they also called it the most dangerous because an artist who could overwrite reality had no natural limit. The only thing stopping them was their own conscience. Ha-eun thought about this for a long time. He thought about the quiet nights, the vanishing villages. If someone with his power had been in Erelon for 15 years and had discovered overwriting, if that person had stopped caring about limits, he looked at Naomi and asked if the archives mentioned other users of the seal of likeness. Naomi said, yes, 1, decades ago. The records were fragmentary, but they described a person who had appeared in the northern mountains and created extraordinary things, beautiful things, living sculptures and painted forests and creatures of impossible grace. And then the records stopped. The last entry said the artist had gone quiet. That was 15 years ago. Ha-eun stood up and went to the wall where he had pinned his map of the vanishing villages. 7 dots moving south. He added 2 more that Seren had gathered from market rumors the previous week. 9 dots. The line was clear, and at the starting point, the northern mountains. He told the room what he had suspected since the first reports. Someone else had his power. Someone who had been here much longer. Someone who was erasing the world. The room was quiet. Minju asked who it was. Ha-eun said he did not know. Seren asked what they should do. Ha-eun said the same thing he always said when a project was too big to comprehend. He said they would work on the next piece and figure out the frame later. The next piece was Naomi herself. She had 3 seals, but she was burned, cut off from her network. Her illusionist abilities were strong but specialized. She could distort perception in a small area, make a room look empty, make a face look different, make a sound come from the wrong direction. Useful for espionage, less useful for survival. She asked Ha-eun to make her stronger. She said it directly. Make me stronger. Give me more seals. Draw me better. He refused. He told her no. She asked why. He said because she was already everything he needed her to be. Naomi looked at him, and her face did something it had probably never done in front of another person. It broke open. Not crying, something before crying. The moment when the wall cracks but is not fallen yet. She asked what he meant. He told her that every person who had ever valued her had valued what she could do, her kills, her missions, her success rate. He said he valued her because she had come back to a basement full of strangers instead of running, because she had chosen people over survival, because that choice was harder than any 3 seals. Naomi was quiet for a long time. Then she said he was the strangest person she had ever been sent to kill. Ha-eun said he got that a lot. That night, Naomi sat with Minju and taught her how to move through a crowd without being noticed. Not magic, technique, weight distribution, eye contact patterns. The art of occupying space so naturally that no one registers your presence. Minju absorbed it all with the hungry focus of a girl who had been teaching herself alone for years and suddenly had a proper instructor. Ha-eun watched from his drawing table and felt something shift in the basement. The group was not just people hiding in the same room anymore. They were starting to teach each other. They were starting to become something. He picked up his pen and a fresh sheet of Everly's paper and began the most ambitious drawing of his life so far. Not a person, not a tool, an album. He drew the cover first, dark leather with silver clasps, then the spine, then the pages, each page rendered individually with the weight and texture of Everly's cotton stock. He drew the stitching in the binding, the way the cover would creak when opened, the indent where a thumb would rest. He worked for 6 hours straight. By dawn, his nose was bleeding and his hands were cramped and his vision was blurred. But on the table in front of him sat an album. 40 pages of paper that had never existed before, bound in leather that he had drawn, stitch by stitch. It was not as good as what Everly could make by hand. The paper was slightly too uniform. The leather was a shade too dark. But it was real, and it was his, and it held 40 blank pages that were waiting for whatever he needed them to be. Everly picked it up and examined it. She tested the binding, flexed the spine, rubbed a page between her fingers. Then she looked at him and said the stitching was wrong. He had used a cross-stitch pattern, where a kettle stitch would have been stronger. The paper grain ran in the wrong direction on pages 12 through 15, and the leather needed to be treated, or it would crack within a month. Ha-eun stared at her. She said she would fix it. She took the album to her bench and began correcting his work, with real tools and real materials. When she was done, the album was better than either of them could have made alone. His magic, her craft, something new. Ha-eun began the portrait of Ijin on a Tuesday night. He did not plan it. He sat down with the album open to a blank page and a bottle of Everly's best black ink, and he started drawing. The face came first. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, dark eyes with a depth that made you feel watched, even on paper. Long black hair that fell past the shoulders in a single wave. He drew her in armor that was not armor. Plates of dark steel layered with shapes that looked like flower petals. Cherry blossom edges on a warrior's shell. The design made no practical sense and perfect emotional sense. She was protection wrapped in beauty. She was the version of strength that did not need to be ugly to be real. He worked for 9 nights. Not continuously, 4 to 6 hours each night. Between sessions, he ate and slept and taught Minju and talked with Seren and helped Everly with her binding. But every night, he returned to the portrait and added more. The hands took a full night. He drew them larger than elegant convention would suggest because he wanted them capable. Hands that could hold a sword and also hold a cup of soup without looking wrong doing either. The eyes took 2 nights because he kept erasing and redrawing them. They needed to be fierce and shy at the same time. On the 5th night, Seren sat beside him and watched. She did not speak. She watched his hand move across the page with the slow, careful attention of someone studying a surgeon. After an hour, she asked him a question. She asked who the woman in the picture was. Ha-eun said he did not know yet. Seren said that was not true. She said every line he drew was a decision about who this person would be. And decisions made at 4 in the morning when no one was watching were the most honest decisions a person could make. Ha-eun stopped drawing. He looked at Seren and saw something in her expression that he had not seen before. Not jealousy, something more complicated. The awareness that he was creating another person, that his attention and his care and pieces of his soul were going into the ink on this page, and that every piece he gave to the new portrait was a piece that Seren already understood the cost of. He told her the truth. He said the world they lived in was dangerous and getting worse. The villages were still vanishing. House Vesper was still hunting them. Kherdun would send another team. And his power came with a cost that made him weaker every time he used it. He needed someone who could fight, not with tricks or knives or illusions. Someone who could stand between the basement and everything outside it and hold. Seren said she understood. Then she said something else. She said she hoped he was drawing the new woman with love and not with fear, because things made from fear broke. Ha-eun looked at the portrait. 9 days of work. The most detailed drawing he had ever attempted. And Seren was right. Some of the lines were driven by desperation. The armor was too thick. The stance was too rigid. He was drawing a shield when he should have been drawing a person. He picked up the erasing compound and carefully removed the armor from the torso. Naomi, who had been pretending to sleep in the corner, opened one eye and watched. Minju was actually asleep. Everly was binding a replacement cover for a merchant's ledger and did not look up. Ha-eun redrew the torso, this time without armor. He drew Ijin in a simple shirt, standing, relaxed, one hand at her side, the other holding something small, a cup, a teacup, because even a warrior needed to drink tea. He drew her barefoot because he wanted her grounded, connected to the floor, not floating above the world in steel petals. He drew her looking slightly to the left, as if someone just out of frame had said something that almost made her smile. On the 9th night, he added the last detail, a small crease at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, the possibility of one. Then he set down the pen. The ink was still wet, the album glowed, and the room filled with the smell of cherry blossoms and steel polish. Ijin stepped out of the page the way a person steps out of a doorway, one foot, then the other. She was tall, taller than Seren. Her hair was exactly as he had drawn it. Her hands were exactly the size he had intended. She stood in the basement and looked around with dark eyes that tracked every shadow and every face. Then she looked at Ha-eun, and she bowed. Not deeply, not subserviently. The bow of someone acknowledging the person who gave them existence. Ha-eun felt the cost hit him like a wave. His vision went white. His nose erupted with blood. His legs gave out, and he hit the floor. Serene caught him before his head struck the stone. The world spun for a long time. When it stopped, he was lying on the cot with a cloth on his forehead and Serene's hand on his wrist. She said he had been unconscious for 6 hours. His fever had spiked to a dangerous level. His body had given everything it had to make the portrait real. He turned his head and saw Ijin standing in the corner of the basement. She had not moved. She stood with her back to the wall, watching the room with the alert stillness of a guard dog. But when she saw him looking at her, something happened to her face. The fierce composure softened. She looked uncertain, shy, like someone at a party who did not know where to sit. Ha-eun lifted a hand that shook badly and waved her over. She came. She moved like water, smooth and fast and completely silent. She knelt beside the cot and looked at him with those dark eyes. Up close, he could see the detail of his own work, the individual strands of hair, the faint texture of skin, the way light played across her irises. She was perfect, and she was terrified. He could see it now, the terror of being new, of being the strongest thing in the room and not knowing what that meant, of being looked at by everyone and understood by no one. He told her it was all right. He told her the basement was safe. He told her there was tea if she wanted it. She looked at the cup in her hand, the one he had drawn. It was empty, but she held it as if it were the most important object in the world. She asked if she could have some. Seren poured tea, and Ijin drank it in small, careful sips, and the room was very quiet. Ha-eun lay on the cot and felt the hollow space inside him where more of himself used to be. He had given Ijin his courage, the specific, stubborn willingness to stand up when everything said, lie down. He could feel its absence like a missing tooth. Every creation took something. Seren had taken his calm. Minju's portrait had taken a small piece of his self-assurance. The album had taken endurance. Ijin had taken the biggest piece yet. He was becoming less. They were becoming more. And he had to decide if that equation balanced. Ha-eun spent 4 days in bed, not by choice. His body simply refused to cooperate. His hands trembled so badly that he could not hold a pen. His vision blurred every few hours. The headaches came in waves that made him curl into a ball and press his face into the pillow. Seren stayed beside him. She changed the cloth on his forehead. She made him drink water and eat the soup that Everly prepared on a small stove they had set up in the corner. She did not tell him to be strong. She did not tell him he would be fine. She sat with him, and that was enough. On the second day, Minju came and sat on the floor beside his cot and showed him her latest drawing. It was a cat. It still looked more like a potato with ears, but the proportions were getting closer. Ha-eun managed a weak smile and told her the whiskers were good. Minju said she had spent an hour on the whiskers. He said it showed. She punched his shoulder gently and left. Naomi handled security. She set up a perimeter of illusion traps around the basement. Anyone approaching would see the building as completely collapsed. Rubble and broken beams and nothing worth investigating. It would not stop a determined search, but it would deter casual discovery. She also made 2 trips to the surface to gather intelligence. The news was not good. House Vesper had posted a new bounty, not just for Ha-eun, for anyone associated with him. The description was vague enough to cover half the sealless population of Arkan, but specific enough to mention a girl with short black hair and a tall woman with gray hair. They were running out of invisibility. Ijin stood guard. She did not need to be told. She positioned herself near the door and stayed there. She ate when food was offered. She drank tea when Seren poured it. She spoke very little. Ha-eun watched her from his cot and saw the problem clearly. She was too strong. Not physically, existentially. She radiated power the way a furnace radiated heat. People flinched when she moved. Minju gave her a wide berth. Even Naomi, with her 3 seals and assassin training, kept her distance. Ijin was alone in a room full of people. On the 3rd day, Ha-eun asked Ijin to sit with him. She did. She sat on the floor beside his cot with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her eyes fixed on the wall. He asked her how she felt. She said she did not understand the question. He said he was asking if she was all right. She said she was functioning correctly. He said that was not what he asked. She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw the thing he had drawn into her, the shyness, the uncertainty, the gap between what she could do and who she was. She told him she was scared. She said the word as if it were a foreign object she had found in her pocket. She said she could feel things inside her, strength, speed, the ability to sense threats before they materialized. A desire to protect that was so strong it felt like gravity. But underneath all of it was a hollow space, a place where certainty should be. She said she was built for a purpose, but she did not know if the purpose was all she was. Ha-eun closed his eyes. He knew that hollow space. He had the same one. Because the courage he had drawn into her was the courage he used to fill his own emptiness. He had given her his best coping mechanism and kept the raw wound underneath. He told her she was more than her purpose. She said that was easy to say. He said it was not easy at all. It was the hardest thing he had ever tried to believe about himself, and he was still working on it. Then he asked her if she wanted a blanket. The question was so mundane after the existential conversation that Ijin blinked. She said she did not know. She said she had never had a blanket. He asked Serin to bring one. Serin brought the warmest one they had, a thick wool blanket that Minju had acquired from somewhere and refused to explain. Ha-eun told Ijin to wrap it around herself. She did. She pulled the blanket tight and sat on the floor, and something in her face changed. Not a smile, but the muscles around her eyes relaxed. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. She looked like a person sitting in a blanket, not a weapon, not a protector, a person who was warm. Ha-eun looked at her and made a decision. When he recovered, he would draw her again. Not to make her stronger, not to add armor or weapons or abilities. He would draw her weak, sick, in bed with a cold, wrapped in a blanket with messy hair and a red nose. He would draw her as someone who could be taken care of, because that was the part of being alive that no one had ever drawn for her. On the fourth evening, Ha-eun got out of bed. His legs were unsteady. His hands still shook, but he could stand and he could hold a pen if he gripped it tight enough. He walked to the table and opened the album. Everly had left a fresh bottle of ink beside it. He dipped the pen, and on a clean page, he drew Ijin, lying in bed, blanket up to her chin, eyes closed, hair spread on a pillow, a cup of tea on a small table beside her, steam rising from the cup. He worked slowly, carefully, every line an act of tenderness rather than power. It took 2 hours. When he finished, the drawing glowed softly, and Ijin made a sound, a small gasp. She looked at her hands. She flexed her fingers. She touched her own face. Then she looked at Ha-eun with an expression that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. It was the look of someone who had just been given permission to be small. Ijin pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep, the first sleep of her existence. Not standby, not the alert stillness of a guard, real sleep, with slow breathing and a slightly open mouth and one hand curled under her chin. Serin stood beside Ha-eun and watched. She told him what he had done. By drawing Ijin vulnerable, he had made vulnerability part of her reality. She could now feel tired. She could feel cold. She could feel the need for rest. He had made her weaker, and in doing so, he had made her more alive. Ha-eun wiped the pen and closed the album. His hands were shaking worse than before. The cost of 2 hours of focused ink work in his current state was severe. His vision was narrowing at the edges, and the headache was coming back like a tide. Serin told him to sit. He sat. She put her hand on his. Her hand was steady. His was not. She said something quiet. She said she understood now why she loved him. Not because he was powerful, not because he had created her, because he looked at a woman who could kill everyone in the room, and his first thought was to make her comfortable. Ha-eun said nothing. He did not trust his voice. He squeezed her hand and looked at Ijin, sleeping in the corner, and felt the hollow space inside him where his courage used to be. And for the first time, the emptiness did not feel like loss. It felt like a room he had cleared to make space for someone else. The hunters came at night, 12 of them, full Vesper livery, 6 seals each minimum. They moved through the streets of the old quarter in 2 columns with practiced silence and converged on the abandoned print shop from both ends of the alley. Naomi's illusions held for 11 seconds. The lead hunter was carrying a dispel rod, a long brass instrument etched with counter runes that ate through magical concealment like acid through paper. The collapsed building illusion shattered and the real door stood exposed. closed. Naomi shouted the warning from the rooftop where she had been keeping watch. One word: coming. The basement erupted into motion. Everly grabbed the album and the ink box and pressed them to her chest. Minju swept the charcoal sticks into a bag and slung it over her shoulder. Seren positioned herself at Ha-eun's side and handed him a fresh sheet of paper and a pen already dipped in ink. Ijin walked to the door. She did not run. She walked. The first hunter kicked the door open and stepped through. He had time to register the tall woman with black hair standing 2 feet away before Ijin moved. She grabbed his chest plate with one hand and threw him back through the doorway into the 3 men behind him. They went down in a crash of armor and stone. The second column came through the side entrance that Minju had discovered on their first day, a narrow passage behind the old press that connected to the next building. 2 hunters emerged with seals blazing on their forearms. Fire and wind. The air in the basement turned hot and spinning. Ha-eun felt the heat on his face, and his hand moved on the paper without conscious thought. He drew a wall, quick, rough, a thick stone barrier between the hunters and Everly, who was closest to the side entrance. The wall appeared with a sound like a thunderclap. Gray stone, 8 feet high, crude and ugly because he had drawn it in 4 seconds, but solid enough to stop the blast of fire that hit it a moment later. The cost hit immediately. His vision went red at the edges. The headache spiked. Blood started from his nose. Ijin was fighting at the front door. She moved between hunters like a brush across canvas, fluid and precise. She did not kill, she disarmed. One man's sword left his hand and embedded in the ceiling. Another's shield bent at an angle that should have been impossible. She was doing exactly what Ha-eun had drawn her to do, protecting. But 12 was too many, even for her. The hunters adapted. They spread out. 3 of them activated barrier seals that created shimmering walls of force between themselves and Ijin. 2 more started a combined casting. Earth and fire. The floor of the basement began to crack and glow. Naomi dropped from the rooftop through the ceiling window. She landed behind the 2 casters and did something with her hands that made the air shimmer. Suddenly, the casters could not see each other. Each one thought the other had moved 10 feet to the left. Their combined spell misfired and blew a hole in the alley wall instead of the basement floor. Minju moved through the chaos like smoke. She was not fighting. She was collecting keys, seal tokens, the small iron badges that hunters carried as identification. She stripped them from belts and pockets with fingers so fast the hunters did not feel the theft until they reached for weapons that were no longer there. Ha-eun stood at the table with the album open. His hands were shaking. His nose was dripping blood onto the page. Seren stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder, not helping, anchoring. He drew, not walls, not weapons. He drew the hunter's seals. Quick ink sketches on scraps of paper. He did not need to be precise. He just needed to see them clearly enough to capture the essence of each mark. Blue lines for water, red for fire, white for wind, green for earth. He drew each seal as he saw it glowing on their forearms. Then he erased them, one by one. The ink smeared under his thumb, and across the room a hunter screamed and clutched his arm as the blue lines on his skin flickered and went dark. Then another, then another. It was not painless. Ha-eun could feel each erasure as a hook in his skull. Every seal he removed cost him blood and focus. By the 5th one, his hands were cramping so badly he could barely hold the pen. By the 8th, his left ear was ringing and his vision had narrowed to a tunnel. Serene's hand tightened on his shoulder. She told him to stop. He erased 2 more. 10 seals gone from 5 different hunters. Those 5 collapsed. Not unconscious, worse, sealless, empty. They lay on the floor of the basement and looked at their bare forearms, and the sounds they made were not screams. They were the sounds of men who had just lost everything that made them matter in this world. The remaining hunters saw what was happening and ran. They did not regroup. They did not attempt a second assault. They turned and fled into the night because the thing in the basement was worse than any weapon. It was erasure, and erasure did not leave anything to heal. Ijin stood at the door, watching them go. She was breathing hard but unhurt. Naomi was nursing a bruised rib from a bad landing. Minju had a collection of 12 iron badges and 3 coin purses that she held up with a grin. Everly still clutched the album to her chest. Her glasses were cracked from a piece of debris. Ha-eun sat down heavily. His nose had stopped bleeding, but only because there was not much left to bleed. His vision was fading. He looked at the 5 men on the floor, sealless, broken. He had done to them what the world had done to him, taken away the marks that made them someone. He felt sick and powerful, and sick about feeling powerful. Seren knelt beside him. She wiped his face with a cloth. She told him they needed to leave. Now, before the hunters returned with reinforcements, before House Vesper sent one of the 7 blades. Ha-eun nodded. He looked at the basement one last time. His studio, the drawings on the wall, the table where he had created Ijin, the corner where Minju practiced her terrible circles, the bench where Everly mixed inks. Home for 7 weeks, gone in 12 minutes. He closed the album and stood. Seren took his arm. They left through the side passage into the alley and then into the dark streets of Arkan. 6 people moving fast through a city that was already talking about the explosions in the old quarter. Behind them, the basement was empty except for 5 men who would never hold a seal again, and a single drawing still pinned to the wall, Minju's portrait. He had left it on purpose, so that anyone who walked in would see a girl standing proud, and know that the people who had been here were not monsters. They were artists. And they had work to do elsewhere. They traveled west for 3 weeks. Naomi chose the route, away from the main roads, through farmland and forest, and the kind of terrain that caravans avoided because the paths were too narrow for wagons. She knew border territory the way Minju knew city streets, instinctively, with an awareness of which shadows were safe and which ones moved. Ha-eun recovered slowly. The mass erasure had cost him more than he expected. His hands trembled for days. His dreams were full of blue lines flickering out and the sounds men made when they became nothing. He drew very little during the journey. Small things, food, a waterproof cover for the album when it rained, a set of sewing needles for Everly when her last one broke. Each creation left him dizzy and winded, but manageable. The big work would have to wait. Ijin carried most of their supplies without complaint. She could walk for 18 hours without rest, and her strength made mountain paths feel like city sidewalks. But Ha-eun noticed that she had changed since the night of the blanket drawing. She sat with the group during meals now. She accepted tea without being offered. Once he caught her looking at a wildflower by the trail with an expression of quiet fascination that had nothing to do with threat assessment. She was becoming a person, slowly, one small experience at a time. On the 14th day, they reached the western edge of Valantia. The landscape changed. Rolling hills gave way to flat marshland and then to rocky coastline. Naomi said there was a fishing town called Seabreak that sat on a harbor too small for military ships. House Vesper had no garrison there. Caer-dun had no agents. It was the kind of place that existed because everyone with power had decided it was not worth controlling. They arrived at dusk. Seabreak was gray stone and salt wind and the smell of fish oil and old rope. 50 buildings clustered around a natural harbor where 6 boats rocked in the current. People moved through the streets with the unhurried gait of those who measured time by tides rather than bells. Minju found them shelter within an hour, an abandoned net-mending loft above a warehouse at the harbor's edge. It was cold and it smelled like brine, but the roof was solid and the floor was dry, and there was a window that faced east for morning light. Ha-eun looked at the window and the work table that had been left behind, and the shelves along the wall, and he felt the familiar pull. He wanted to work. Not because he needed to, because the space asked for it, the way a blank page asks for a line. Everly set up her tools the same day. She had carried her binding equipment across 3 weeks of wilderness without losing a single awl. She began making paper immediately. Seabrake had a cotton trader who supplied sailcloth to the fishermen. The offcuts and scraps were useless for sails, but perfect for pulping. Within 4 days, Everly had produced 8 sheets of heavy stock that she declared adequate. Not good, adequate. She said good would take another week and proper equipment. Ha-eun said adequate was more than enough. Naomi established a security routine, morning and evening sweeps of the harbor, contacts with 2 local fishermen who sailed north regularly and could report unusual ship movements, an escape route by sea if needed. She worked with quiet efficiency and spoke to the group more each day, though her words were still measured and precise. Seren ran the household. She negotiated with the fish market for daily supplies. She learned the tides and the weather patterns and the names of every person in Seabrake within a week. She also watched Ha-eun. She watched him the way she always did, with the patient attention of someone who could see the cracks before they reached the surface. On the 6th night in Seabrake, she told him he needed to draw. Not for survival, not for defense, for himself. She said his hands were steadier now, and his color was better, but there was something behind his eyes that worried her. A distance. As if part of him was still in the basement, watching blue lines go dark on 5 men's arms. He said he was fine. She gave him the look that he had learned meant the word fine was about to be retired from their shared vocabulary. He sat at the table. Everly's paper was in front of him. The ink was ready. He picked up the pen, and for the first time since arriving in Erelon, he drew something that was not a tool or a weapon or a person or food. He drew the harbor, as seen from the window, the boats rocking in the dark water, the reflection of the moon on the surface, the distant smudge of the far shore, the silhouette of a fisherman mending nets on the dock. He drew it for no reason other than that it was beautiful, and he wanted to remember what beauty looked like when it was not a strategic resource. The drawing did not come alive, it did not glow. It sat on the paper and did what drawings are supposed to do. It existed as a record of seeing. Seren looked at it and said it was the best thing he had made since the day he drew her. He said it was just a landscape. She said that was why it was good. Because for once, he had not been trying to save anyone, just to look. The next morning, a letter arrived. Not by post, by bird. A black hawk with a silver band on its leg landed on the windowsill and stared at Ha-eun with the kind of focused malice that only trained raptors and debt collectors possessed. The letter was sealed with the crest of House Vesper. Ha-eun opened it. The letter was from Lord Cassian Vesper himself. It was brief and written in elegant script. It said that Ha-eun had 3 options: surrender himself to House Vesper and serve as a court asset, leave Valantia permanently and never return, or watch as House Vesper demonstrated what 8 seals could do to a fishing town of 50 buildings and 300 people. The deadline was 7 days. Ha-eun read the letter twice. Then he set it on the table and looked at the group. 6 people in a net loft above a fish warehouse. A drawn woman, a thief, a bookbinder, a warrior goddess, a defected spy, and a tired artist with blood on his sleeve and an incomplete seal on his palm. Against a great house with 500 soldiers and 7 generations of political power. Seren asked what the letter said. He told them. The room was quiet. Then Minju said something that surprised everyone, including herself. She said they should fight, not run, fight. Ha-eun asked why. Minju said because every time they ran, someone behind them paid the price. Tomas in Leanbrook, the 5 sealless men in the basement, Brother Oren in the monastery, Running meant surviving while other people burned. She said she was tired of other people burning. Ha-eun looked at this small, scarred girl who drew egg-shaped circles and stole apples and slept with a knife under her pillow. He looked at all of them, and he opened the album to a blank page. Ha-eun spent 5 of the 7 days drawing. He did not draw soldiers. He did not draw walls or weapons or traps. He drew flowers. Small white flowers with 5 petals each. He drew them, one at a time, with the slow, precise attention of a botanical illustrator. Each flower was slightly different. Different curve to the stem, different angle of the petals, different stage of bloom. He drew 47 flowers on 6 pages of the album, and each one was a tiny masterpiece of observation. Saren watched and said nothing. Naomi watched and looked confused. Minju watched and said he had finally lost his mind. Everly watched and mixed more ink because she understood that sometimes the artist knew things the audience did not. On the 4th day, Ha-eun asked Ijin to train with Naomi. Not fighting, coordination. He needed them to work together during whatever was coming. Ijin moved, and Naomi misdirected. Strength and illusion. Ijin could hit what she could reach, and Naomi could make sure that what needed reaching was where Ijin expected it to be. They practiced in the warehouse below the loft. Within 2 days, they had developed a rhythm that made Ha-eun think of ink and paper. One was the medium, the other was the mark. Neither worked as well alone. On the 5th day, Haley Ashford arrived. She walked into Seabreak at noon, carrying a long sword and a sealed warrant from the Church of Seven Seals, authorizing the execution of one Ha-eun of unknown origin for crimes of heresy against the ethereal order. She was 27 years old. Silver-gray streak in dark hair pulled back tight, 5 seals on her forearms, military posture that turned every step into a declaration of controlled violence, scars on her hands and neck from years of inquisitorial work. She walked into the net loft as if the door had been left open for her specifically. It had not. She had picked the lock in under 3 seconds. Ijin was on her before she crossed the threshold. The two of them hit the floor in a tangle of limbs and steel. Ijin had the advantage in raw power, but Haley fought with a technical precision that compensated. 5 seals of combat enhancement, speed, strength, reflexes, durability, pain suppression. She was a weapon with a theology degree. The fight lasted 8 seconds before Ha-eun said, "Stop." He said it quietly. Both women froze, not because the word carried authority, because it carried exhaustion. The bone-deep tiredness of a man who had watched too many people try to kill each other over marks on skin. Haley looked at him from the floor, with Ijin's hand on her throat. She said she had expected more resistance from a heretic. He said he was not a heretic. He was a freelancer. The distinction was theological. Haley's warrant authorized his death on the grounds that the seal of likeness was an abomination, a perversion of the ethereal order. The Church of Seven Seals taught that only the 7 recognized elements could be bound to human flesh, and anything else was heresy. Ha-eun's ability to create and erase did not fit any of the 7 categories. Therefore, he was a violation of divine law and needed to be corrected. Ha-eun asked her if she believed that. Haley said belief was not relevant. Orders were. He asked her again. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she had believed once, before the church burned her sister. Her younger sister had been 12 years old. She had failed the seal initiation the same way Ha-eun had, a broken mark, an incomplete binding. The church classified her as corrupted rather than empty because the seal had partially activated before failing. Partial activation was considered worse than no activation. It suggested that the Ethereum had touched the child and recoiled. The theological term was tainted. The practical term was death sentence. They burned her on a Tuesday. Haley had been 19 and already 3 seals deep in the inquisitorial order. She had received the report by letter, official church correspondence. Her sister's name was listed under resolved cases between a man convicted of seal forgery and a woman accused of unlicensed healing. The letter did not mention that the resolved case was a 12-year-old girl. It did not need to. Ha-eun listened. Then he did something he had not planned. He opened the album and drew. Not a weapon, not a tool, a grave, a small stone marker with a name on it. He did not know the name, so he left the stone blank and handed the pen to Haley. She looked at the pen. She looked at the blank stone in the drawing. She looked at Ha-eun. Then she took the pen and wrote her sister's name on the stone in small, careful letters. Lyra Ashford. The drawing glowed. In the corner of the loft, where morning light came through the window, a small stone marker appeared, gray granite, simple, with the name Lyra Ashford carved in the face, and at its base, 3 wildflowers that Ha-eun had added while Haley was writing. White petals, 5 each, the same flowers he had been drawing all week. Haley knelt in front of the stone and was quiet for a very long time. When she stood, her face was different, not softer, clearer, as if something that had been out of focus for 8 years had finally resolved. She set her sword on the table. She folded the execution warrant and tore it in half. She asked where she could sleep. Seren showed her the corner. The 7th day came. Ha-eun stood at the window and watched House Vesper's forces arrive. They came by road from the north. 40 soldiers in black leather, 8 mounted officers with full seal arrays glowing like torches in the afternoon sun. And at the center, riding a white horse with silver tack, was Lord Cassian Vesper. 8 seals, perfect silver beard, the posture of a man who had never once questioned his right to anything. They formed a line at the edge of town. Cassian dismounted and walked to the harbor square, alone. He stood in the center and waited. Ha-eun walked out to meet him. Behind him, Ijin and Haley flanked. Naomi was already somewhere in the crowd, doing what she did best. Minju was doing what she did best somewhere else. Everly was in the loft guarding the album, with a bookbinder's awl in one hand and a bone folder in the other. Cassian looked at Ha-eun, and his expression was one of genuine disgust. He said the boy looked worse than the report suggested. Thin, pale, blood-crusted nostrils, shaking hands. He said this was what happened when the Ethereum gave power to those who did not deserve it. The body rejected the gift. Ha-eun said nothing. He held the album open to the pages of flowers. Cassian looked at the drawings and laughed. He asked if the boy intended to defeat House Vesper with a garden. Ha-eun looked at Lord Cassian Vesper, standing in the harbor square, and saw a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. 8 seals glowing on his arms, silver beard trimmed to the millimeter, boots polished to a mirror finish. Behind him, 40 soldiers waited with the patient discipline of men who had been winning so long they had forgotten the mechanics of losing. Ha-eun asked Cassian a question. He asked the Lord if he had ever made anything. Cassian frowned. He said he had built a house, the greatest house in Valantia. Ha-eun said he had not built it. He had ordered it built. Other hands cut the stone. Other backs carried it. Other minds designed the arches and the windows. Cassian had signed a paper and called it creation. That was not building. That was purchasing. Cassian's face darkened. He said the boy was stalling. Ha-eun said he was not. He was explaining. Then he knelt in the harbor square and pressed the album flat against the cobblestones. The pages of flowers faced the ground. Naomi moved first. From somewhere in the crowd, she activated her 3 seals and the square shifted. Every soldier saw a different version of reality. Some saw Ha-eun standing on the left. Some saw him on the right. Some saw 2 of him. The formation broke as men turned to face threats that did not exist. Haley hit the right flank, 5 seals blazing. She did not use her sword. She used her hands and the combat techniques of 8 years of inquisitorial training. She moved through soldiers the way a teacher moves through a classroom, with absolute knowledge of where everyone was and what they were about to do wrong. She disarmed 6 men in 11 seconds. Not gently. Joints bent the wrong way, wrists turned until weapons fell. Efficient and brutal and completely non-lethal because Ha-eun had asked her not to kill. She had said she would try. Ijin took the left flank. She was not subtle. She walked through the soldiers like a stone through water. Shields buckled when she touched them. Armor dented under her open palm. She threw men aside with the casual strength of someone rearranging furniture. 10 soldiers down in 20 seconds. None dead, all broken in ways that would heal, but not quickly. Minju was everywhere and nowhere. She had spent the previous night planting the iron identification badges she had stolen from the hunters in Arkan on the belts and in the pockets of Cassian's soldiers while they camped outside town. Now she moved through the chaos, collecting the badges back. Each one she took left a soldier unable to activate their seals because the badges were keyed to the Vesper command chain, and losing one triggered an automatic lockout, a security measure designed to prevent desertion. Minju had spent 3 days studying the mechanism with Naomi's help. 14 soldiers lost seal access in the first minute without a single blow being struck. Cassian stood in the center of the chaos and watched his army disintegrate. He did not panic. He was too disciplined for panic. He raised his right arm and all 8 seals ignited simultaneously. The air in the square turned thick and electric. Ha-eun felt the pressure on his skin like a hand pressing down. Cassian was preparing a combined elemental assault. 8 seals channeled together could level a city block. Ha-eun pressed his thumb to the album page, the page of flowers. 47 white flowers, each drawn with careful individual attention over 5 days of patient work. He smeared the ink. Not all of it, just the stems. The connection between flower and page, the roots. The flowers activated. Not on the paper, in the square. They erupted from the cobblestones around Cassian's feet. Small white flowers pushing through the gaps between stones. 1, then 5, then 20, then hundreds. They grew from the ground, as if the entire square had been a garden waiting for permission. The cobblestones cracked, not violently, gently, the way ice cracks in spring when the ground beneath remembers that it can grow things. Cassian looked down. The flowers were climbing his boots, not attacking, growing. Vines of green wrapped around his ankles with the slow, patient insistence of nature reclaiming a ruin. He tried to move and found that the ground was no longer stone, it was soil, rich, dark soil that had not seen sunlight in centuries. The flowers spread outward in a circle. Every crack in every stone became a garden. The soldiers, still standing, watched as the cobblestones of the harbor square lifted and broke apart and white flowers covered everything. Cassian's seals flared. He tried to burn the plants away. Fire erupted from his hands and scorched a patch of flowers to ash. They grew back in 2 seconds. He tried ice. The flowers froze and shattered, and new ones pushed up through the frozen remains. He tried force. A shockwave rippled outward and flattened every flower in a 10-foot radius. They were back before the dust settled, because they were not magic. They were drawings, each one rendered with the precision and care of a man who understood that a petal was not just a shape, but a structure, a system of cells and veins and light-catching surfaces. Ha-eun had not drawn weapons. He had drawn life, and life did not stop because someone told it to. Ha-eun stood and walked toward Cassian. The Lord was knee-deep in flowers now. His seals were flickering. 8 simultaneous channels drained even the strongest mage. He was burning through his reserves, trying to destroy something that could not be destroyed because it was not fighting him. It was just growing. Ha-eun stopped 3 feet away. He opened the album to a clean page. He looked at Cassian's arms. 8 seals. Blue, red, white, green, gold, silver, black, violet. 8 marks of power that represented a lifetime of pain and privilege and the absolute certainty that strength was the only currency that mattered. Ha-eun drew the first seal, the blue one, water element. He drew it exactly as it appeared on Cassian's forearm. Then he erased it. Cassian screamed. The blue lines on his arm went dark. 7 seals. Ha-eun drew the second. Red. Fire. Erased. Cassian dropped to one knee. 6. The third. 4th. 5th. Each one a quick sketch and a thumb stroke. Each one a hook in Ha-eun's skull. Blood was pouring from his nose now. Not dripping, pouring. His vision was nearly gone. He was drawing by feel, by memory, by the knowledge that these marks were just lines, and lines could be removed. 6th, 7th. Cassian was on his knees in the flowers. No sound. He had stopped screaming. He stared at his arms as the last glowing lines flickered. Ha-eun drew the 8th seal. Violet, the rarest, the most powerful. He drew it with shaking hands and blood-smeared fingers. Then he pressed his thumb to the page. The last seal went dark. Cassian Vesper knelt in a field of white flowers with bare arms and bare skin, and nothing. No marks, no power, no identity. He was sealless, empty, the same as every person he had ever despised, the same as the children he had sent to the mines, the same as the girl whose portrait hung in a basement in Arkan, the same as Ha-eun. Cassian looked up at the thin, bleeding artist standing over him, and the sound he made was not rage, it was not grief. It was the sound of a man encountering himself without armor for the first time in 48 years and finding nothing underneath. Ha-eun closed the album. He turned to Seren, who was standing at the edge of the square, holding his spare charcoal and a clean cloth. She handed him the cloth. He wiped his face. The soldiers were gone. Some had fled when their commander fell. Some had laid down their weapons when the flowers reached their feet. A few stood staring at the garden that had been a military square 5 minutes ago. Ha-eun looked at Seren and said the words that had been building in him since the first line he drew in the monastery. He said they should go home. He said they had work to do. Then he collapsed. Seren caught him. She always caught him. Ijin lifted him and carried him back to the loft with the same arms that had thrown soldiers through walls. He weighed nothing in her hands. She held him the way he had drawn her, holding a teacup, carefully, as if the thing she carried was precious because it was fragile. Ha-eun was unconscious for 3 days. Seren did not leave his side. She changed his bandages and monitored his breathing, and once, in the middle of the second night, when his fever spiked and his body shook so hard the cot rattled, she lay down beside him and held him until it passed. Not because the warmth helped medically, because some things the body needed could not be drawn. On the morning of the 4th day, he opened his eyes. The loft was quiet. Morning light came through the east window and fell across the work table in a warm rectangle that reminded him of his apartment in Seoul. For a moment, he did not know which life he was in. Then he saw Seren sitting beside him with a cup of tea, and he remembered everything. She told him what had happened. House Vesper's forces had scattered after Cassian fell. The soldiers who remained had been absorbed into the Seabreak community. 2 of them had asked Everly for work. Cassian himself had been found the next morning sitting in the flower-covered square, staring at his bare arms. No one had approached him. No one had hurt him. He simply sat there for 2 days until a fisherman's wife brought him soup and told him he was blocking traffic. Cassian had taken the soup and said thank you. It was reportedly the first time anyone had heard him say those words. News of the battle had traveled fast. Not as a military report, as a story. The kind of story that grew in the telling. An artist who grew flowers from stone. A lord brought to his knees not by force, but by nature. Seals erased like chalk from a board. The story reached Arkan in 4 days. It reached the capital in 6. It reached the border of Caer-Dun in 10. And it reached the northern mountains in 12. Ha-eun did not know this yet. He was focused on more immediate concerns. His hands had stopped shaking, but they felt different, lighter, as if something structural had been removed from the bones. The mass erasure of Cassian's 8 seals had cost more than blood and consciousness. It had taken something from his fine motor control. His lines were less precise now, a fraction of a degree off from where he intended them. For anyone else, this would be invisible. For an artist who had spent 7 years training his hand to obey his eye, it was a catastrophe. He sat at the work table on the 5th day and tried to draw a straight line. It wobbled. He tried again. Wobbled. He tried a circle. Close, but not closed. The gap at the joining point was barely visible, but he could feel it. He put down the pen and stared at his hands. Serin sat across from him and waited. She did not offer comfort. She did not say it would get better. She waited for him to arrive at whatever he was going to feel, and she was there when he got there. He told her his hands were broken. Not physically. The connection between his intention and his execution had been damaged. The cost of erasing too many seals too fast. She asked if it was permanent. He said he did not know. She asked what he wanted to do. He picked up the pen and drew another line. It wobbled. He drew another, wobbled less. Another, still imperfect, but closer. He told her he was going to do what he had always done when his work was not good enough. Practice until it was. Minju sat with him that evening. She had her own charcoal and her own paper, and she drew her circles beside him while he drew his lines. Her circles were still terrible. His lines were still wrong. But they sat together and worked, and neither of them pretended that the work was easy. Everly repaired the album. The pages Ha-eun had used for the flowers were spent. The ink had transferred to the cobblestones, and the paper was blank now. She rebound the album with new pages and treated the leather and reinforced the spine. When she gave it back to him, she told him it was ready for whatever came next. Naomi spent the week building an intelligence network among the fishing boats. She had contacts now, sailors who traveled the coast and could carry messages and gather information. She also wrote a formal letter of resignation to the Cairdoon Intelligence Corps and sent it by merchant ship. She knew they would never receive it because the ship was going in the wrong direction. That was the point. It was a gesture, a ceremony of leaving that mattered only to her. Haley prayed, not to the Church of Seven Seals. She stood in the loft at dawn each morning and faced the window and said words that were not scripture. They were something new. She was building her own practice out of the ruins of the one that had failed her. Ha-eun heard her once through the thin walls. She was praying to the morning light, asking it to be steady, asking it to be enough. Ijin sat on the roof at night and watched the stars. Ha-eun found her there one evening and sat beside her. They did not speak for a long time. Then Ijin said she could feel something in the north, a pressure, like a storm that was not weather. She said it had been growing since the night Ha-eun erased Cassian's seals. She said whatever was in the north had noticed them. Ha-eun looked at the dark horizon, the quiet nights, the vanishing villages, the line of disappearance moving south. He had been so focused on House Vesper that he had pushed the larger threat to the back of his mind. But the larger threat had not pushed him anywhere. It had been watching, waiting, and now it knew where he was. On the 10th day, a message arrived. Not by hawk, not by letter, by drawing. Ha-eun found it in the morning, tucked under the door of the loft. A single sheet of paper, fine quality. On it was a drawing of Seabreak, the harbor, the boats, the loft, rendered in ink with a technical skill that made Ha-eun's breath stop. Every line was perfect. The proportions were exact. The shadows were mathematically correct. It was the work of someone who understood drawing not as art, but as architecture. As engineering, as the systematic dismantling of reality into component lines. And in the corner of the drawing, in small, precise letters, was a single word. Soon. Ha-eun held the paper and felt cold spread through his chest. The other one, the first bearer of the Seal of Likeness, the one who had been in Erelon for 15 years and had created beautiful things and then stopped creating and started erasing. The one the archives called quiet. He was not quiet. He was just patient, and he knew where Ha-eun lived. Ha-eun showed the drawing to the group. The room was silent. Then Seren spoke. She said they needed to find this person before he found them. Ha-eun said he agreed, but first he needed to do something else. He sat at the work table and opened the album. His hands were still imperfect. His lines still wobbled, but he picked up the pen and began to draw. He drew a boy, small, maybe 8 years old, sealless, standing with his back straight and a smile on his face and a clean shirt and the kind of posture that said someone had told him he mattered. It was not a real boy. It was not for anyone specific. It was a practice piece, a reminder. He drew it because Minju had told him about a boy in Lienbrook who had been sealless and beaten by the other children, and who used to stand outside the engraver's shop looking at the drawings in the window. She said the boy had asked once if someone could draw him a friend. Ha-eun finished the drawing. It was not his best work. The lines wobbled in places. The proportions were slightly off. But the boy on the page was standing and smiling, and for a small, imperfect drawing, that was enough. He closed the album and looked at his hands, still shaking, still damaged, still his. He looked at the people around him, a woman he had drawn from loneliness, who had become the steadiest person he knew, a thief who was learning to see herself, a bookbinder whose craft held his power together, a warrior who had learned to sleep, a spy who had chosen a basement over an empire, an inquisitor who prayed to morning light. 7 people in a fishing loft on the edge of the world, with a storm coming from the north, and a drawing that said, soon. Ha-eun picked up his pen. The line wobbled. He drew it again. The wobble was smaller. Again, smaller still. He would keep drawing. Not because his hands were steady, because steadiness was not the point. The point was that he drew at all. The point was that in a world that measured worth by the marks burned into your skin, there was a man who measured worth by the marks he chose to put on paper. And he was not done choosing. Not yet. Serene handed him a fresh bottle of ink. He took it. Their fingers touched. Her hand was warm. His was cold. She held on for a moment longer than necessary. Then she let go, and he dipped the pen and started a new page. Outside the window, the sea moved under the morning light, and somewhere in the north, a patient artist waited. But here in the loft, the ink was wet, and the paper was ready, and the work continued. Because that was what artists did. They continued, especially when nobody asked them to.